how do we maximize our impact? How do we transcend just the traditional scientific audience that a lot of people reach and try to have a greater impact, on the world? And first of all, I guess we just ask the question, why? Why would you go public? And I think the answers are sort of obvious. Obviously, you can elevate your scientific impact by reaching a much broader audience. You can vastly increase your pool of audience. I mean, think about the number of people that read scientific journals versus the number of people, say, for example, reading newspapers or reading blogs or reading websites. And, of course, you're much more likely to affect changes in the real world if you get outside the traditional journals into dealing with people in the real world that are actually out there making real decisions about what's going on. So I think that this is, generally speaking, it's a very effective thing to do. And I'd also emphasize that, a lot of the people that we regard as the leaders, the big guns, they really actively court the media. And I originally wasn't going to put names on here because I thought I was just going to test you and see how many of these you know. So Tom Lovejoy, how many people have heard of Tom Lovejoy? Okay. One of the reasons, Tom Lovejoy is a very famous tropical biologist, and if this was a tropical crowd, there would have been a lot of hands going up because he writes a lot of editorials for the New York Times and things like that. Terry Hughes, you guys know what Terry Hughes is? Okay, he's the head of the Center for Excellence for the Coral Reef Studies. He's a very media savvy guy. This guy here, who's this obscure fellow, some of you might have heard of him. And he's also known to slightly court the media, I think once or twice. This is an old Smithsonian colleague of mine, Jeremy Jackson. He's been one of the real... Jeremy has now moved to Southern California and is the only scientist I know who actually has a media advisor. And he actually pays a media advisor. He's there. He does lots of hobnobbing with movie stars and with Hollywood producers and stuff like that. He's been very effective. He's winning all kinds of awards now as a result of that. And Diane Fossey. Diane Fossey looks very sort of, tranquil and everything. She is very savvy in dealing with the media. Don't kid yourself for 1 second. That sort of sitting there holding the chimpanzees and stuff. She really knows how to market herself very, very well. And I do the same thing too. Just throw a few think this is my wife doesn't like this photo. She says I'm looking flirty with lovely Liz, but that's in the Amazon. And then this is Elizabeth Rosenthal, who's the main environment editor for the New York Times, which is by far the biggest impact newspaper in North America. And that's David Attenborough back there doing something we're doing in London. So I take a shot at trying to do some of this stuff too. And first, what I'd like to do is a couple of things here. Is firstly to talk about strategies for maximizing your public impact, and then secondly, strategies for dealing with journalists, because journalists are a different kind of human being than what we're used to dealing with. And so we want to talk a little bit about how we relate to dealing with journalists. So first of all, just some general strategies, and I imagine some of these are probably fairly obvious. But hey, if you want to be a leader, initiate stuff. Okay, be an initiator. And just oftentimes what you'll find is that the leaders are the people who step up and say they're the leaders. They're the ones who are just willing to stand up there and say, hey, I'm taking a lead here. So you can sponsor a workshop or a symposium. You can edit a book, submit papers to strong journals. That's an obvious one. But writing editorials and essays, that's sort of showing a leadership role. And here's something I do. I mean, some people may consider this really cheeky. But when I see something going on, I write to them. I say, hey, you should choose me as your keynote. I'd be great. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't even write back, but sometimes they do. And give it a shot. Why not? So I think all in all, just be shameless. I think Australian culture does have, and it's one of the things I actually find most likable about Australians. But there is obviously this tall poppy thing, and some people traditionally consider attention-seeking unseemly, but I'd say just get over it, okay? If you want to get out there and have an impact, and I think people are increasingly doing this, including Australians, don't be backward about stepping forward. Just put your hand up, and guess what? It actually works. If you just sit there and waiting for the world to beat a path to your door and recognize your brilliance, I don't think it's going to happen as fast as you might hope. 2, go for the big issues. Be willing to go out there and just go for the really interesting, controversial, important issues. When I was a grad student at Berkeley, there's a guy, Alan Wilson, who was using genetic techniques, that kind of cutting-edge genetic techniques, but they were the same techniques that people were using to study evolution of rats and bats and birds, and they were publishing in all these specialized journals. He was using it to study human evolution. And he was publishing in Nature and Science, and he was just very, very hot. He was studying humans. Guess what? Anything to do with humans, human evolution is automatically, almost by definition, important. Work on charismatic species. pick really important issues. For example, RED, this is the carbon trading for forest conservation. It's happening now. It stands for reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. This is a very hot and topical issue here. The global biodiversity crisis, this is something that people are very engaged in, and also really hot debates. And sort of encapsulating these two things, I've recently been involved in a big debate, and others, Corey Bradshaw and Barry Brook and others have been involved in this too, with a controversial scientist, a former colleague of mine, Joe Wright, who really argued quite emphatically that the number of species that are likely to go extinct in the coming century, especially in the tropics, is probably a lot lower than people have traditionally thought. And this is really and so, I was engaged in this debate. We had a series of articles, both pro and con, with this idea, and that's actually a cover that I designed that was for the Conservation Biology, which is a very high-impact journal in our particular field. So, focus on the hot debates. Don't be afraid to get in there and mix it up. Get in the debate. Get your views out there. This is I mentioned this very briefly. This is one of the biggest issues that we were ever involved in. And I think, we basically asked, what is the future of the Amazon likely to be? And we involved a year of work by 8 people. It was a big effort. A lot of different data went into a GIS model with 61 different data layers in it. A lot of interactions there. A lot of thought went into that. But ultimately did get it published in Science. And this actually had a really big impact in Brazil. I did over 200 media interviews in the 3 months after this was published. I ended up testifying before Brazil's National Congress and lots of other public venues and things, and really being part of the debate. But it was a big question. It was a big, important question because Brazil at that time was on the verge of putting $40 billion of new highways, roads, and other hydroelectric dams and other infrastructure projects in the Amazon. Completely unprecedented. Nobody had said, what is the impact of all that going to be? People talked about the individual projects, but no one had said, look, if you look at the whole basin, what will that mean? So that was one that I would. Develop a nose for a good story. I was up in North Queensland, and I hope this doesn't sound too repetitive because I'm going to use examples of my own things. And hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm trying to say I'm really clever, I'm really clever, I'm really clever. But develop a nose for a good story. I was up in North Queensland, and Steve Williams, who works on climate change up in the wet tropics region at James Cook, one of my colleagues at James Cook, this is before I came to JCU about a year and a half ago. Steve was talking about this white possum that nobody had seen for almost 5 years, and it hadn't been seen since a severe heat wave in late 2005. And it's this beautiful, charismatic animal. It's a white form of the lemuroid ringtail possum. And I said, Steve, this is an iconic thing. I mean, this is this incredible, beautiful animal. It's probably disappeared as a result of global warming. It also illustrates the fact that we're very well may lose a lot more species in the tropics than we think due to global warming because there's so many thermal specialists. I said, get the message out there. Start talking to the media. And he did, and this ended up being published in the Australian and in the Courier Mail in Queensland, and he got a lot of press out of this. And I've actually he didn't really go international, and so I've been publishing a number of popular articles, basically giving all due credit to Steve, but also bringing in the elements of this broader story and trying to reach a much broader audience in North America and Europe and the UK, for example. So I think, try to develop a sense of what's going to sell, what's going to be a good story that's going to capture people's interest and imagination. Be creative and entrepreneurial. This is Todd Capson, one of my former colleagues in Panama. Todd was one of the most outgoing, vivacious, determined conservationists I've ever met. He spoke very fluent Spanish, and he used to go out to all these communities all over Panama talking about conservation in a really authoritative way. And one of the things that he ended up doing was getting together with the makers of the board game Monopoly and developing a special Panama environment Monopoly game. And he marketed that, and it was beautifully done. It was so thoughtfully done because it really hit all the right notes. Panamanians are very proud of what they call their national patrimony. It's their national heritage and their national environment, and it just touched all the right notes in a very clever way. And he was really good at flogging that. I mean, I just thought that was such a creative and interesting way to try to capture the imagination of people that might not normally do that type of thing. I've occasionally been involved in doing things like this myself. This was this biodiversity debate that I mentioned that I was engaged in. I'm not sorry, by the way, I'm not sure what's happening. A few of my slides are doing a little bit of funny things there, but this was a biodiversity debate that I was involved in with Joe Wright, and I got the idea of, like, let's focus on the personalities here a little bit. Let's play up the controversial aspects of this. And so we ended up sort of promoting it as this big professional wrestling match. I have to say, Joe initially was a little, not so keen on the idea, and that's Joe there, obviously, by the way, and that's me on top. But he eventually went along with it. I think he got a little more sus when he saw how I actually presented him in the actual symposium itself. He felt that I was trying to make this a little too polarized, and perhaps presenting him in a particular light, and also presenting myself in a slightly different light. Joe still isn't really talking to me very much, but that's not entirely true either. Another thing, think internationally. I do think this is an issue here in Australia in particular. I mean, obviously it's an island continent. I think there is I certainly know in North Queensland people tend to think about the Australian media. They tend to think about reaching the regional and local and national media, but they oftentimes don't think about getting overseas. And really, Australia's 20 million people on a planet going towards 7 billion here, and there's a lot of important messages that need to get out there to a much wider audience. And so I really think, try to think about a global audience there as much as you can. And I just mentioned here, I didn't really keep track of my media stories until 2008. I just started keeping track then. So I'm averaging now, when I say 135 stories over those 2 years, that's where it's like a press release where I'm specifically quoted or mentioned or discussed or talking about our research, or like a major web news website that's mentioning something that we did, but it has to mention actually me by name. But a lot of this, and this is covering a wide range of different things here. New York Times, and this is just an example. BBC, New Scientist, International Herald Tribune. This is a major newspaper in Brazil. Folha de Sao Paulo, Le Monde, El País in Spain, National Public Radio, 60 Minutes Australia. So, I think the idea is to try to transcend just having an audience here in Australia. When you publish an interesting paper, look, you're just getting started. Okay, don't just publish your paper and then leave it. Write a press release, okay, and work with your press officers, and they'll help you. And there's some skills involved in sort of writing a press release, getting it out there in a short, tight, palatable way for a general audience. But email, I like to do. I'll oftentimes, if I've got a paper I'm proud of, I'll do a big emailing to a lot of colleagues, and that helps to get it out there. A lot of people said, "Wow, I wouldn't have seen it if you hadn't done that." Distribute it to editors and interact with people that are doing webzines and blogs and newsletters. Contact the local journalists, and also there may be we will often contact New Scientist. They get a good coverage, and so we'll often contact them and say, look, there's a paper coming through the pipeline. Would you be interested in covering it? If so, let us know. We'll send you more information. We'll send you quotes. We'll send you that type of thing. And I think you can really increase your public impact and even your impact with other scientists by trying to do that. And publish popular stuff. This is a really, popular magazine articles, books, newspaper articles, letters to the editor, blogs. A lot of people are into blogging these days. I have to say I have not gotten into blogging yet, but some people, Corey's really into blogging. A lot of people are into blogging and finding, you're getting how many hits a day? 200, 400 a day? 300-400 hits a day. So that's, a day. So that's a lot. So, but I think there's lots of strategies out there that you can try to transcend the traditional scientific audience here. And then some hints for dealing with journalists. So as I mentioned, journalists have their own particular world, and it's not the way they operate is obviously not the way that we as scientists operate, and so it's sort of these two cultures trying to meet and trying to find common ground here and how we can interact with them in the most effective way. First of all, I'd say, look, reach out, build bridges, contact journalists. I mean, don't wait for them to contact you. You want to establish linkages with journalists that you think are going to be effective. I've just listed some of the ones that I can email anytime and say, look, I've got something interesting coming through the pipeline. Would you be interested in something more about that? And very often I get a response back. And also there's media companies that are actually, that's what they do, is try to link up experts for, say, the ABC is running a story on the IPCC controversy and what's going on with that. They are the ones that are helping ABC find the relevant experts. There was that IPCC controversy you might have heard about recently, and an email was sent around to our whole university saying they're looking for relevant experts. I called the media company up and I said, hey, not only am I an expert on or I'd be happy to talk to you about IPCC, I'd give them a whole big list of other things I'd be happy to talk to them about. I just said, call me for just about anything. I'm happy to talk to you. And they're like, oh, okay. And the journalists don't freak out about that kind of stuff. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah, that's cool. Invest time in helping journalists. I've organized several major trips to places, and we took, for example, 60 Minutes in the New Yorker, BBC to the Amazon, and the New Yorker also to the New York Times, to Panama. A lot of time and effort went into organizing this, dealing with all the logistics, dealing with all the language issues, setting everything up for them, but got really great media coverage as a result of that. And cast a wide net. If you work on intertidal snail foraging ecology, the journalistic world is probably not going to frequently beat a path to your door. But if you present yourself as an expert on life in the sea, guess what? And you parlay that expertise in gastropod ecology and in your broader knowledge about what's happening in marine ecosystems, they will come to you all the time. So I very oftentimes find I'll get a query from a journalist and say, do you know anything about this project in Suriname? And and I'll say, yeah, give me 2 hours. Give me a call. And I'll go online and I'll talk to people. And by the time they call, I'm like, and you don't have to be, absolutely up to speed on every nuance of this thing. I say, yeah, and they just want a couple, quotes. Oh, it's a terrible idea. Don't know. The scientist says, environmental destruction. So become an instant expert. Respond immediately. Look, if you're not ready to respond right away, forget it. They will not, journalists are not going to wait around for you. They will, it's now or never. So you have to be willing to live by their time frame. So get back to them right now. And I actually do this on my travel messages sometimes, especially for a little bit longer trip. I'll say, I'm traveling. I'm not going to get back to you right away unless you're a journalist. And there you are. Here's the number to call, or email me, and I will get back to you straight away. I understand. That shows them that you really understand that how they work. Speak plainly. Oh, jeez. I just get so frustrated sometimes with scientists, and I hear them like on the radio, and they going on and on and on. What journalists want are nice, short, punchy answers, okay? They want things, they're going to soundbite you, and they're going to chop things up into pieces very often, especially for things like radio and TV. And they don't want long-winded answers, and they don't want you to equivocate. They hate it when you put, 16 qualifying clauses into a sentence. Just say what you think is going to happen, okay? And just be unequivocal about it. Relax. Use humor and analogies. That works really well. Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist at Oxford, he is one of the best analogizers I have ever seen. I don't know if you guys saw him interviewed here recently. They had him up with like some Australian fundamentalist politicians, and then Dawkins, and then they were talking about education and other issues. And Dawkins, they had some guy there that believed the world was less than 10,000 years old. And Dawkins is like, that's like saying the United States is 5 yards wide. He was putting it in, and what a great example, Yeah, I get it now. Yeah, huh. We have a lot of people in the U.S. that think the U.S. is only 5 yards wide, by the way. Avoid jargon. This is another thing. You really have to avoid jargon. I was driving down the road up in North Queensland, and I was listening to an ABC show, and they were interviewing this lass who was a postdoc at the Ames Marine Science Center in James Cook, and she was really good. I mean, I was just so impressed. She was going on and on. She'd been studying shark behavior. I missed the first little bit of it, but clearly, I mean, she was just so good, and the journalist just kept asking her questions and questions, again, because she was on a roll. It was so, and I thought, wow, and I'm listening, and I'm like, she's going for a 9. I was like, go, girl, go, go, go. And then she says, so what species are you working on? She goes, well, I'm working on a few shark species and several teleosts. I went, ugh! Teleosts. I'm a biologist. I have a PhD in zoology. I know what they are. But imagine the guy out there with a beer in central Queensland going, and she said it like 6 more times. And I was like, oh. So she didn't get a 9. She got a 4, for that. But she was doing so well up to that point. It was tragic, really. When you're dealing with journalists, there are just no stupid questions, okay? You will not be favorably treated like a journalist if you go, oh, that is the dumbest question I have ever heard in my life. Journalists don't like to be treated like that. You will find your life will not be very pleasant. Help the journalists. Journalists are jacks of all trades. They've got to do everything. You know, in the morning they're talking to some guy about the latest stock market thing, and then in the afternoon they're talking to some guy who's, you know, an industrial chemist, and then they're talking to somebody about some social issue, and then here you are, a scientist, and they're trying to ask you, you know, some intelligible question, and you're kind of, you know, help them. I often say to them, well, a good, you know, especially if I'm going to do a taped interview or something, I'd say, well, you know, a few good things you could ask. This is important. This is really interesting. And they're like, oh, thank you very much. They love to be prompted. They love to have you give them some guidance. Also, of course, if you have a press release, you can say, look, this hits a lot of the important things. Or you can also give them additional information. You can say, here are 10 good, really interesting questions that you might ask about this particular issue. Just spoon feed them. They love it. They appreciate it. And they don't have time to, you know, unless they're really an environmental specialist that knows a lot about your specific area, they're not going to, they're really going to appreciate that type of thing. Something to remember here, we had a big discussion about this at a media training workshop I was involved in before. Basically, in this modern world, you can't really say this is off the record. Okay, journalists, some will respect it, some won't. If you want to say that the head of your school is an SOB, I would suggest you not say that at all. Don't say off the record, he's a real SOB, you know, because you may find, in fact, that that gets repeated. So basically, there's no such thing of absolute guarantee of off the record in this day and age dealing with journalists. Some do respect that, but there's a lot of gray area. And so basically, just don't assume anything you say to a journalist could appear in print. And look, journalists deal in a different world. We're used to, like, you know, staring at every sentence and spinning it around and rewriting it and recasting it. They got to get the story out then and there. Okay, they've got maybe an hour to write a story. They cannot worry about all the nuances. This is why you've got to give it to them simply. And guess what? You're going to get misquoted sometimes. There's going to be spin you don't like. I've done interviews with journalists where when I was involved in the World Heritage controversy up in North Queensland back in the 80s, I remember doing this interview and I was so mollifying and so like, oh, you know, we all need to have, but I talked to this guy for about an hour and he taped it and he pulled out every little sentence that I said like in an hour that made it sound like I was the most inflammatory, you know, SOB, trying to get the other side wound up, and wrote this very polarizing article. And I was so mad because I thought that's not the gist of what I was saying at all. But it's going to happen sometimes. So if you're going to wade in this pond, deal with it. This will happen, and it definitely will. Have a mission. Look, journalists will pick up. If you just want to be the media star, you know, this is not the way to go about it. You want to use this as a forum, as a mission, to tell people about something that's important, something you believe in, maybe something you think is worth fighting. I work in the environmental realm, and that's why talking to the media is absolutely essential in order to getting our message out. If we're just publishing in scientific journals, we aren't coming anywhere close to achieving the kind of impact that we can achieve, which is why I always make time for journalists whenever I can possibly do that. And we have plenty of enemies out there, plenty of people out there that are trying to basically forward, and this is not even talking about, of course, Fox News or something like that, where they really don't want to have any kind of imbalance, even a semblance of balance at all. But of course, just even out in the popular media, people like Lomborg and Crichton and many others out there. And this person here, I forgot what his name was, but it didn't like him very much when he was there, obviously. So just in concluding here, I think your media and your public relations really should be just as important as your science. You should think about them as being just as important. You should invest time in them. You should invest energy in them. And I think you will really increase your impact. You'll increase your standing among your peers, and you will increase your standing among the greater public, and you'll have a lot greater impact. And I just contrast here the annual readerships of Conservation Biology, which is a very high-rated, rigorous journal. It's hard to publish in, versus New Scientist. So there's 11,500 people that subscribe to Conservation Biology. There's 750,000 people worldwide that subscribe to New Scientist. And it is infinitely easier to publish in New Scientist, and they even pay you for it. So I just say get out there and go for it and publish in lots of those popular journals. And I hope these little things have helped a little bit. And when the media call, I hope that rather than looking like this, you look like that. So thank you.